And he asked me to give a talk on St. Francis of Assisi, especially St. Bonaventure's life of Francis. So, I don't know that I'll follow this strictly, but I'm going to give you a bit of an overview into a bit of the life of Francis. It's a fairly long text, so we can't just all read it tonight. But I'd like to make a couple of observations that I think might be worth knowing about why St. Francis is so important to St. Bonaventure. Besides that, he just founded his order. Okay? So I'll finish chewing this piece of pizza, and we'll get started. Sit around in my chair, get some water. So guys, when did St. Bonaventure live?
After St. Francis.
That's pretty good. You know your stuff. Okay. Does anybody know? Who's he quite contemporary with?
Aquinas.
Ah, when did Aquinas live?
Until 1274?
That's when he fell off his horse and died. He did. He got knocked off his horse and hit his head. And did not get better. Didn't make it to the Second Council of Lyon. Bonaventure lasted only a little later. He lasted through the Second Council of Lyon, only to be poisoned. Well, we don't know that for sure, but there is a theory that Bonaventure was poisoned. He died on July 15th, 1274. He was probably born either 1217 or 1221, so he's a little bit older than Aquinas, but quite contemporary. Unlike Aquinas, who was a Dominican, Bonaventure was a
Franciscan.
That's right, Franciscan. The Franciscan order and the Dominican order arose at a similar time and in somewhat similar situations. They're religious orders, but they're not monks. They are friars, and the other M word?
Mendicants.
Mendicants. Has anyone heard the word mendicant before? All right, what does mendicant mean?
They beg.
Begging orders. Okay. So this form of religious life, this begging religious life, is fundamental to understanding who St. Francis is. So St. Francis of Assisi, who was he? Well, who sort of generally knows his story? It's okay if you don't. All right. So St. Francis of Assisi, born in the late 12th century, and by the early 13th century, was living the life of a penitent. So he lived a intentionally penitential life, and he was the son of a cloth merchant named Peter Bernardone. And Francis may or may not have been a knight, or had gone to war for a little bit, lost and got injured, and in this time experienced a sort of more radical conversion. That's how the older lives of Francis go. But in Bonaventure's life from Francis, he simply never went to war. That's sort of covered over a little bit. Now, Francis is famous for having founded a religious order. And what's distinct about his religious order, as I said, they're a bunch of beggars, which is unlike monks. Monks were not beggars. Monks lived in religious communities. There were other religious in the Middle Ages too, not just monks. Anyone ever heard of a canon? Does anyone know a canon? Now we know a canon. But not quite the same, but kind of similar. There were Augustinian canons who would travel around, but they weren't begging. They followed a rule of St. Augustine. One of the most famous set of canons were the canons of the Church of St. Victor in Paris. If you've ever heard of the Victorines, you may, if you've ever done any theological study, they were some pretty cool dudes in the 12th century, paving the way for the great syntheses of the 13th century. I know this is sounding all very technical. We'll stay that long. So, Francis was not a canon. He was not a monk. He rejected the riches of his father. His father was kind of a, let's say, middle class, economically well-to-do, but not a noble. Francis rejected all this, and he decided he wanted to live a life founded on poverty. Not just poverty in general, but particularly gospel poverty, responding to Christ's command to go sell all you have, give it to the poor, and you will store up treasure in heaven, and follow me. And so Francis did that quite literally, and there are many stories about how he did that, although we won't talk about that tonight. And what happened after that is other people joined him. And so he ended up being the center of a small religious community. There were about 8 fellows at first, then 12, and they expanded so that in Bonaventure's time there were 35,000. People who were attracted by a life of penance, poverty, prayer, and preaching. This was something else that this layman, Francis, did that was rather unusual. He was a lay preacher. Now, recently, everyone remembered how on the blog sphere, the Twitter sphere, the internet, somebody there was this big to-do about who can preach and who can't preach recently. Does anyone remember that? All y'all live on the internet. Well, there was. And what's interesting with the Middle Ages is that the Middle Ages are not sort of a direct copy of our idealized church of today. In the Middle Ages, people got into all sorts of trouble. People did all sorts of things. In fact, there were some abbesses in the Middle Ages who had pontifical right to preach in their own monasteries or their own convents. Some of them who wielded quite a lot of power, too. There were only a few of them, but there were some preaching abbesses who held the positions for at least 500 years with pontifical right. The Pope said, yes, you can do it, because you've always been doing it. And so Francis was not an ordained man. Later in life, he probably became a deacon. But he was a preacher. Hello. Come sit down. I'm talking about why Francis is so radical and different, and why he caused a whole bunch of trouble. So Francis was not ordained. He was not a monk. He was not a priest, at least at first. And like I said, he later probably became a deacon. But he went around preaching for people to do penance. And his brothers that had joined him also preached. And this created some tension. So you have a bunch of lay preachers going around telling people to do penance, wandering into dioceses. Yes.
Did Brother Junipero preach?
I think so as well.
Did he?
I'm not sure. I have to double check. But the Franciscans were, and quickly became a preaching order that wandered around, begged, or sometimes worked for people to make money, and said, you need to live a life of penance, come live like us, or come live as much like us as possible. So this was very attractive to many people, but at the same time, many people found it kind of disturbing, people who had certain amounts of authority in the church. So there were monks who thought, these people are living like a religious order, or they're living in a religious community, but they don't have the official right to do so. They are going around preaching without express permission to do so. And more than that, they're going around and living a life of express begging. How unbecoming! Especially when the Franciscans said, we are living the exact life that Christ lived. This is a debate that would later happen around the Franciscans. The question was raised, okay, was poverty the way for that Christ lived because that is the most Christ-like way to live, or is that the way he lived out of necessity, but it was not necessary for him to live that way? The Franciscans said the former. This is the most Christ-like life. This was a large debate that happened later on in their history. But anyway, you can see why Francis was a controversial figure. Eventually, by 1208, they had some official sanction, some official rules. And Francis, at that point, received tonsure, and he and the other brothers, so that they were made officially clerics. Not ordained clerics, but they received the actual right to preach. The Dominicans received something similar. So they were, in fact, primarily non-ordained preachers. On top of this, Francis said, okay, we have the official right to preach now, but I don't want any ordained ministers in my order. Not because he was against them. He had a great reverence for priests, but he didn't want anybody who had any standing or particular dignity associated with them. He wanted to live the most humble life possible. He also didn't really want scholars. In fact, in one of the earlier lives of Francis by Thomas of Celano, he forbids it. Bonaventure takes that passage and snips it a little bit. So, the Franciscans were a rather radical movement. And when you think about the history of the church, often when we look at things, when we look at the past, we tend to idealize it. We say, oh, it was so wonderful back then. Everything was so rightly ordered before the church fell apart. But if you read the writings of Francis or the writings of Bonaventure, they're all going, we live in the most impious time ever. The church is flaming. It's a pile of dung. Nobody goes to church anymore. Nobody does penance. Nobody cares about their sins. We live in a horrible time. We're at the end of the world. The Antichrist is coming soon. And in fact, Francis, by his early followers, was regarded as a kind of apocalyptic figure. They thought, oh, this Francis guy, he's so much like Christ that surely the end is near. Francis, in fact, he's a sign that the end is near, and or maybe even there were some who thought the new age of the Spirit is coming, in which everybody's going to live like a Franciscan. In fact, a number of Franciscans believed this. And that's actually how we ended up getting Bonaventure. One of the leaders of the Franciscan order, the one previous to Bonaventure, explicitly agreed with a Joachimite text that is a text based on the writings of this older Benedictine abbot, Joachim of Fiore, which predicted a coming age of the Holy Spirit in 1260. meaning an age in which everybody would live like monks. It's kind of like what people expected 2012 to be, radical change in consciousness and all that, but for the Middle Ages. So Francis was a figure that was extremely popular and yet also incited a lot of, not necessarily division, but conflict in the church. Now the Franciscan order did develop. It didn't remain as raw in its poverty. It embraced poverty, but it became institutionalized. In the, let's say, 30 years or so after Francis's death, there began to be a number of clerics, priests, deacons, and even some Franciscan bishops. Franciscans actually started going to school. In fact, there were so many of them at Paris, along with the Dominicans, that many of the secular teachers, by secular I don't mean non-religious, but not non-Christian, but non-members of religious communities at Paris. So the secular teachers thought, oh, these religious guys are taking over our school. We need to put a limit on them. And they were reduced to having only one theologian each, one Dominican theologian, one Franciscan theologian. And on top of that, because they started to take priests into their order, and there were a number of priests around in the Middle Ages who were making a good amount of money off of all the services they provided, they found some of their income disappearing. And so there was another set of people who were angry at the Franciscans. So the Franciscans, by the time Bonaventure came to lead them in 1257, about 31 years after Francis's own death, were embroiled in so many different conflicts that it was thought that, well, we've had some lives of Francis before, but we really need to have an official life of Francis to say what this guy was about, as a way of saying, what is our order about? What does it mean to be a Franciscan, or a member of the orders of friars minor, or the lesser brothers, to these brothers who profess humility? Now, what does that mean to Bonaventure? That's what we get by reading this Life of Francis, which is the text I'm going to talk to you about tonight. This was a major biography. So it relied on the earlier biographical sources, mainly the two biographies by a fellow named Thomas of Celano, who interviewed people who knew Francis while he was alive, as well as the Life of St. Francis by Julian of Spare, and Thomas of Celano's treatise on the miracles, and then some other first-hand accounts. Bonaventure took all that older material and reorganized it into a new life. He did some interviews himself, and he added some interpretive material, and boom, you have this text that says, here is the Franciscan Order's official version of why Francis is important. It's really quite an incredible undertaking that he's edited all these texts to give his own version of Francis. And so he's drawing different stories and the wording, and then sometimes changing it, and rearranging it, giving it its own order. He actually divides the work up in a really interesting way. He breaks it into 15 chapters plus an introduction. And in that organization, what he does is he kind of makes this nested structure, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit. I think it gives us some clues to how to read the text. But what he's doing is taking all this older material and reinterpreting it in his own era, for a Franciscan order that is no longer living in the woods, right? A Franciscan order that's no longer simply going around preaching and wandering from place to place. They're quite well developed at this point. They still profess poverty as extremely important. In fact, it becomes a big crisis for them a little after Bonaventure dies, in which at least some Franciscans end up burned at the stake. I think they were actually the good guys. But, what he has to do is articulate a vision of how you can be Franciscan, profess poverty and humility, and yet have cardinals give you things, like houses, and books, and vestments, and university positions. So how can you be like Francis, who stripped all of his clothes off in front of a bishop, and wandered around the countryside? How can you say, we want to live that life that he lived, if you're sitting in a university chair? Good question. I do the same thing myself, right? I'm a university kind of professor, instructor, and I love Franciscanism. So how do you do this? Well, you have a family. That's how. No. So that's the background here. Francis is a theological figure for Bonaventure. He's an image of what a Christian life should be. Okay? This is something that you need to understand when you come to this text. It's not just a biography of someone who was the sort of the founder of their order. But for Bonaventure, he's the model Christian. In fact, he is a model of what it means to be Christ-like. So I'll read a little bit of the introduction to you, and then I'll tell you what bit of this text I want to deal with today. Hold on. So hopefully, was that enough background on the text and sort of why Franciscans are in an interesting situation, why they were so controversial, hopefully? Okay. And why it was necessary to have a new biography that sort of said, well, what is this guy about anyway, since we have so many questions? All right. This is some pretty wild stuff. Get ready for it. At least wild in my point of view. Pretty metal. Okay. Here begins the prologue to the life of Blessed Francis. The grace of our Savior has appeared in these last days, meaning in Bonaventure's own time, in his servant Francis, to all who are truly humble and lovers of holy poverty, who, while venerating in him God's superabundant mercy, learned by his example to reject wholeheartedly ungodliness and worldly passions, to live in conformity with Christ, and to thirst after blessed hope with unflagging desire. In an outpouring of kindness, the Most High God looked upon him, that's Francis, a little poor and contrite man, so that he not only lifted the needy man from the dust of a worldly life, but also gave him as a light for believers. Right? Francis is not just some holy guy. Francis is this light for believers. A practitioner, a leader, and a herald of gospel perfection, that by bearing witness to the light, he might prepare for the Lord a way of light and peace to the hearts of his faithful. For Bonaventure and the early Franciscans, they saw Francis as, he's the cure for the problems of the church. Francis is going to set this thing on fire. He's going to reinvigorate the church. He's that kind of figure for these guys. Not just some holy guy. He's the guy who's going to get this thing started again. Shining with the splendor of his life and teaching, like the morning star in the midst of the clouds, by his resplendent rays he guided into the light those sitting in darkness and the shadow of death. And like the rainbows shining among the clouds of glory, he made manifest in himself the sign of the Lord's covenant. He's referring to what here? Not spider webs, but the stigmata. Right, the stigmata. He preached to people the gospel of peace and salvation, being himself an angel of true peace. Like John the Baptist, he was destined by God to prepare in the desert a way of highest poverty and to preach repentance by word and example. First endowed with the gifts of divine grace, he was then enriched by the merit of unshakable virtue and filled with the spirit of prophecy. He was also assigned an angelic ministry and was totally aflame with a seraphic fire. Like a hierarchic man, lifted on a fiery chariot, it may be reasonably accepted as true that he came in the spirit and the power of Elijah. But sort of the expectation of a second Elijah is also kind of fulfilled for them in Francis. I mean, these guys are fanatics. I mean, as many founders of religious orders and their early followers are, they are kind of fanatics. Like, they really believe in this guy. As will appear quite clearly in the course of his life. And so in the true prophecy of that friend of the bridegroom, John the Apostle and Evangelist, he is considered not without reason to be like the angel ascending from the rising sun, bearing the seal of the living God. For at the opening of the sixth seal, says John in the Apocalypse, I saw another angel ascending from the rising sun, having the sign of the living God. Really, they're reading him as an apocalyptic figure. Like I said, this is pretty metal. If we consider the height of his extraordinary sanctity, if we come to the conclusion without any doubt that this messenger of God, worthy of love by Christ, imitation by us, and admiration by the world. So he's a model for imitation. This whole text is about giving a model of what we ought to imitate. Not just the Franciscans particularly, but even those who are, let's say, third order. Those who want to live a Franciscan life without being official members of the order. That becomes known as the Brothers of Penance, sort of lay Franciscans as we know them today. Was God's servant, Francis. In this, while living among humans, he was an imitator of angelic purity. He was placed as an example for the perfect followers of Christ. This conviction should be faithfully and devotedly in the forefront of our minds. Not only does this advance the mission he held, of calling to weep and mourn, to shave one's head and wear sackcloth, and to sign the tau, that's the T, on the foreheads of those moaning and grieving, with a sign of a penitential cross, and of a habit conformed to the cross, and even more, it confirms with the irrefutable testimony of truth that the seal of the likeness of the living God, that is, of Christ crucified, was imprinted on his body, not by natural forces or human skill, but the wondrous power of the Spirit of the living God. So for them, at least for Bonaventure, he's saying that he received the stigmata is this big thumbs up saying, yep, if you want to be like Christ, be like Francis. So that's, it's half the prologue, I won't read the rest. That gives you a sense of what this text is about. It's not saying, wasn't Francis a really great guy? Wasn't Francis particularly exceptional? No one's going to be like Francis. Rather, Bonaventure's saying, if you want to see what Christ is like, and if you want to see how to live like Christ, you have to look at, what's your proximate exemplar? What's your closest example? Francis. And that's why Bonaventure is writing this text. So we can know what Francis was like. Of course, this is a curated text being written about 33 years after Francis's death. It's not the earliest life, but this is the picture that Bonaventure wants us to have. So this is what he thinks is, or what can be distilled from Francis. This is where you get into this question of, well, what's the authentic Francis? Have you ever heard of the question of the historical Jesus? Meaning, in scholarship, especially in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, there's this question of, who is the historical Jesus? What was he really like behind the Gospels? And it's a good question. The Gospels were obviously written by people long after his death, and can there be embellishment and they're still being divinely inspired? Yes, of course. And so there rises this question: what was Jesus really like? If we had a photo and a video camera, if we could say, what was the man like before John gave him all these nicely rounded words? That question sort of arose for Franciscan scholarship in the early 20th century. Who's the real Francis behind this sort of Bonaventurean version or these other versions? What's the guy really like? Well, we don't really have access to that very easily. What we do have is Bonaventure's theological picture of what he thinks Francis represents. Bonaventure probably never met Francis. He died after Bonaventure was born, but Bonaventure would have been quite young. Bonaventure actually has a personal connection with Francis. When he was young, he was sick, and his mother asked Francis for help. We're not sure if that means that Francis was in town and prayed over young Bonaventure, or his name was actually John. No one's actually named Bonaventure at birth. It doesn't happen like that. You have to earn that kind of name. Anyway, I guess now, I'm sure there's some Catholic family out there that has this is our Aquinas Bonaventure. It's like, oh, did you choose that name? Okay, you know them. No. Or it could have been that his mother simply had a devotion to St. Francis, prayed, and Bonaventure was healed. But Bonaventure brings this up several times, saying how he was saved from sickness as a boy, and why he has this devotion to St. Francis. So it's also quite personal. But Bonaventure is giving us an image. He's saying this is what Francis represents theologically, and that's important. Why? Well, evidently, the Franciscans weren't living just like Francis was originally. So you have to have some sort of interpretation of what this model of life looks like in a situation that's not Francis and his friends wandering around in the forest, being penitents and begging, right? And a model that can be continued in an institutionalized church and flexible. And so that's what this text is. It's a meditation on what Francis means. It's trying to be historical, but it's also adapted. So what I want to draw out for you today is, I think, one of the core pieces of Bonaventure's vision of what Francis is, and that's his perfection. You might say, oh great, perfection, that means he's really, really good. Or perfection, well, that's like the top level. That's great. What does that even mean? Well, what I want to address is this idea of what perfection actually means. What's that content? How do you decide something is perfect? Well, for Bonaventure, there's sort of two models of perfection working here. You heard in that little introduction that Bonaventure was saying that Francis is one who is a practitioner of what kind of perfection? Does anybody remember?
Evangelical.
Yeah, evangelical or gospel perfection, which is sometimes associated with the evangelical counsels, which are
The Beatitudes.
well, poverty, chastity, and obedience. Right. Poverty, chastity, and obedience. And to this, you'd probably join humility, prayer, piety, charity, all these things that make him like Christ in the Gospels. You might say, well, does Christ show obedience? Yeah, in a sense, he shows obedience to his Father, at least in his humanity. So, on the one hand, we have this very gospel-derived model of what perfection looks like. Renouncing your goods, praying, having a sort of austerity in your passions, letting go of your own will and obedience, living a life, therefore, of humility, one devoted also to prayer. But there's another model of perfection that's lying behind here. And there's a word that only shows up once. Bonaventure's such a sneaky guy. He winks. Watch this. I said, like a hierarchic man lifted up in a fiery chariot. Okay, what the heck is a hierarchic man? Why does he drop this all of a sudden here? This vir hierarchicus in the Latin?
A priest?
Well, the funny thing is, that's a good, you're on the right track. Francis was never a priest, and Bonaventure only mentions that he was a deacon once in here. Bonaventure doesn't really care that he was a deacon. Yeah, he was a deacon. Doesn't really matter in his vision of Francis. Okay, this is interesting. So, Bonaventure is someone who appropriates this idea of hierarchy. And I was talking to Joe about this a little bit earlier. Hierarchy is this idea, or a word put to an idea, from a, let's say, late 5th or early 6th century mysterious Christian figure known as Dionysius the Areopagite, or Pseudo-Dionysius. He was one of the engines of theological development, especially in the 13th century, when his works came to be read quite widely. That's probably Patrick?
I'm guessing.
Yeah, we'll find out. I'll wait a second. This is a good chance for a water break if anybody needs it. Pizza break, old-fashioned break. It's also... Oh, no, I'm all right for the moment. Although maybe it is a good time for my own water break. Hello.
Hey.
Luke, please meet you.
Mike Renzel.
All right. So, this figure, Pseudo-Dionysius, is the one who introduces the term hierarchy. Hierarchy is based off this Greek word hierarchos, which means a cultic chief, like a polemarchos, which is a general. A hierarchos is the worship general. He's the leader of worship. And hierarchia is just what he does. So hierarchy is just what a chief priest does, what a high priest does. Hierarchy becomes associated with this whole scheme, however, that Dionysius lays out, of how the divine light is mediated from God through Christ, who is the divine light, coming to the first triad of angels, the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, who then pass it on through their performance of their own priesthood, which is totally conformed to Christ. They pass on Christ, the divine light, to the next set of angels, who are the virtues, powers, and principalities, and usually end up being later. So we have the powers, the virtues, and why is the word dominations? There we go, and the dominations, and then we have the prince, who then pass it on through their own hierarchy, that there is their own priestly action, to the principalities, archangels, and angels, who then, in some way that's not really explained to us, but connected to the way in which the angels are connected to Christ, pass it on to the church, which has its own distinction of the bishop, the priests, and the deacon, and then under them we have the monks, the laity, and everybody else who's under purification. So there's this whole system whereby the divine light descends through the performance of hierarchy. And in the angels worship, their telete, which is a word that means like sacrament, is entirely intellectual, not meaning, it's entirely noetic. So there's nothing bodily that the angels do with their sacrament in Dionysius' world. They just pass it on directly through their being conformed to Christ. But at the level of the church, we pass it on through sensible sacraments. And that's where this word hierarchy comes from. And Dionysius explains how, in the church, there are three different sort of acts that this divine light does to us. It purifies us, it illuminates us, and perfects us. So for Dionysius, purification means turns us away from evil. Illumination means that we are now able to see through this light and start to become like Christ. And then by perfection, we become united to God and even are able then to continue the act of passing this divine light along. And this whole scheme gets drawn up by 12th century and 13th century Latin thinkers who start reading this Dionysius guy. That's where our word hierarchy comes from. I think it's sort of transferred into a political sense later on. And so what he's saying here is, as a hierarchic man, meaning someone who has undergone this purification, this illumination, and perfection, and thereby has been conformed to Christ and to the angels, to everybody who is mediating the divine light above. You notice how he used all that angelic language to talk about Francis. Well, because he's a hierarchic man. He's conformed to Christ and the angels. And this idea of perfection, the Dionysian sense of perfection as union to God, likeness to God, and therefore cooperation in God's own act of sending that light forward, is the Dionysian sense of perfection that's joined with the sense of gospel perfection, from which Bonaventure gives us this complete picture of who is Francis. Well, the picture that we get is, through this gospel perfection, he shows that he has been united to God, that he's become like God or become like Christ, and therefore shares in the act of sharing that same light out to, well, everyone else. This is the sense of perfection that you get, this joined sort of really historical gospel perfection, this really tangible sense of gospel perfection, and this very theoretical sense of Dionysian, angelic, heavenly perfection. And that runs through this whole text. So what does that look like in Bonaventure's presentation of Francis? All right, now we get to go to the sheet. So, in the first chapter of the life of Francis, Francis is actually already a pretty swell guy. Unlike other versions of the life of Francis, the older ones, in which he was not so great to begin with, Bonaventure says, no, Francis is in a sense already quite good. He was already a nice, pious guy to begin with, which is an interesting place to begin. So many stories of saints will start by saying how terrible they were, right? The saint was really, really bad. This saint was a sinner in every possible way. But then, the saint found Jesus and got better. Right? We've all heard the story before, right? It's a very common trope in hagiographies. I'm being kind of silly about it, but that's just to emphasize just how general it is. We've all seen it before, right? Ignatius of Loyola, right? He was a terrible dude. Then he got shot by a cannonball, and he got better. Right. What's interesting here is, why does Bonaventure start by making Francis already pretty good to begin with? Well, you might say, well, he just loved Francis so much, he just couldn't bear to think of Francis as not a great dude. No. Bonaventure has no problem with that. What Bonaventure is going to be showing you is that, in fact, he started good, but he became so much better, that he became so much more perfect. Perfection for Bonaventure is not something that's just becomes this one sort of step where you go, you're done. It's this ongoing and ever-deepening process. So you start to see perfection from the beginning in him, but it becomes even more and more intense, all the way to his stigmata and death. I think that's my reading on why we don't start with naughty Francis. We start with good Francis, who becomes better and best Francis. Okay, so in this first chapter, the worst that Francis gets is he's kind of afraid of poor people and lepers especially. So can I have a volunteer to read number 1 over here on the first side of the sheet? By the way, it's not March 26, 2018. It was at one point, not anymore. Sure, Joe, you read it.
All right. Life of St. Francis. Number 1.
Great.
Poverty is the special way to salvation.
Oh, no, other side of the sheet.
Oh, my bad.
That's a secret. You're not supposed to know that yet.
Oh, okay. Well, never mind. Life of St. Francis. 1.1. Francis was always generous.
See, he's always good.
But on one occasion, when he was caught up in the pressures of business, contrary to his usual manner of acting, he sent away empty-handed a poor man who begged alms for the love of God. Immediately turning back to his
immediately.
heart,
That was my fault.
Okay,
my typo.
Immediately turning back to his heart, he ran after him, and gently, with extravagant alms, he promised God that from that moment, while he had the means, he would not refuse those who begged from him for the love of God. He observed with his untiring piety until his death.
Yeah, he observed this with untiring piety until his death. So piety is this concept that comes in here. Piety is this act of love, and we'll see how it has multiple directions in one act in a moment. So piety here meets up with someone who is in a state of
Grace.
or rather, another P word. So we've got someone, Francis, And he encounters someone who's in a state of poverty. Poverty, piety, and as we'll see, perfection are always linked in this text. And that's what I want to bring up today. So this is Francis's moment of conversion. He's usually a good guy, but one day he's really busy. He's like, get away from me. And then he realizes, I shouldn't have done that. And then he promises, through piety, to always care for those who are begging. Always. Okay. This is this sort of first moment that determines the rest of so much of this text. But what we'll see here is that piety and poverty have a really interesting interplay. Let's read this next section from the same chapter. Who would like to read number 2? Or 1.2? Sure, your name is?
Matt.
Matt, go for it.
After a long sickness, Francis, dressed as usual in his fine clothes, met a knight who was of noble birth, but poor and badly clothed. Moved by a pious impulse of care for his poverty, he took off his own garments and clothed the man on the spot. At one and the same time, he fulfilled the twofold duty of piety by covering over the embarrassment of a noble knight and relieving that of a poor human being.
Yeah, that should be relieving the, I think probably the need or the poverty of a poor human being. There you go. Okay, look at this. This is really interesting. So we've got Francis here, and he encounters who? A knight. Someone who is technically above him by social status, but also, in a sense, below him in need. So where do we go here? Yeah. So he took off his own garments and clothed the man on the spot. At one and the same time, he fulfilled the twofold duty of piety by covering over the embarrassment of a noble knight and relieving the need of a poor human being. What we see here is this sort of innate double direction of piety in this text. When Bonaventure talks about piety, he means this act that always has two directions in it. One going, one going up, and the other going down. One going up so that their honor is given above, and that need is fulfilled in a downward direction. And how does he do it? He does it through piety, but also through, what does Francis do? How does he clothe the knight? Humility, physically. How does he do this? Humility.
Giving up his own goods.
Takes off his own clothes. So he performs an act through piety that is also an act of humility and poverty. So here we get this really interesting interplay that gets even more developed. So it's not just that it's pious to help poor people. Actually, what Bonaventure does is he shows us that Francis serves the poor and God through piety, a piety that is performed through his own act of poverty. So through his poverty, he enriches the poor and is elevated to God. This is the reoccurring motif of this text. It occurs again and again and again. If you want to go up, you have to go down. If you are truly going down, you are also therefore going up. This is the logic of perfection in this text. If you want to go up, you have to go down. If you want to go to God, you have to go through the poor. If you go to the poor, you will find your way to God. Jimmy.
So then it's a callback to like the Good Samaritan where he goes down in
Absolutely.
Jericho and then to be brought back up.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And actually, Bonaventure has a commentary on that passage as well. Yeah. And so here what we see is Francis at work in the world even before he's become a Franciscan. So this is just stage one for Bonaventure, but it's really demonstrative of what he sees as sort of the core of Francis's action in terms of its shape. Going up and down can't be separated. So true piety is at once the love of God and the love of those in need. Those can't be separated. You can't do one or the other. You could have to do one through the other, which you actually see in this next passage. So we'll skip 6a. We'll go to 1.6b. Can I have someone to read 1.6b?
To poor beggars, he even wished to not only his possessions...
To give away. You see, I have a terrible thing with typos.
Alright, to give away his possessions, but his very self, sometimes taking off his clothes, at others altering them, and yet others having nothing else at hand, ripping them in pieces to give to them. To poor priests he also provided help, reverently and piously, especially in the appointments of the altar, and in this way he both became a participant in divine worship and provided assistance for the need of his celebrants.
Right, you see, so on the one hand, those two passages are really interesting, because we see that Francis is not only giving away his things, he wants to give away even his self. And so he wants to give not just things that he has, but he wants to move towards this complete act of giving. And this will really be developed later in the text, especially when we get to his stigmata, when he's basically like the walking dead. In chapter 14, after he receives his stigmata, Francis can't even move himself around. He has to be carried from place to place. He's become so weak, and yet he's at his most powerful when he's in this utter weakness, in which he's sort of totally melted away. He's this emaciated skeleton, and when he dies, he's naked on the ground. The Gospels being read over him, and it's very liturgical. And this is the best of Francis. It's totally upside down, right? When we think of the best, we're like, the best. I will be strongest, and I will be fastest, and I will be smartest, and then I will be perfect. Francis says, no, I'm going to die naked on the ground, and that's when I'm the best. Pretty wild stuff. Not easy to stomach. Nice to read about it. You're like, that's really holy. And you're like, but I'll do something else. I'll eat pizza. And then we have this second incredible paragraph where it talks about how Francis provides for the needs of priests. And it doubles down in the sense of moving up and down at the same time. Because what does he do? Well, he gives away his things. He sells sometimes his own clothes or belongings so that he can provide for the needs of priests who don't have stuff for their altar. You know, he can buy them a chalice or an altar cloth or even simpler things. And so he, through his poverty, provides for the needy at the same time as becoming a participant in divine worship. You know, Francis was never a priest, but here Bonaventure from the beginning links him with the altar, which is important because Francis is going to be developed into this cruciform sacrificial figure, which is pretty cool. So right there at the beginning, we get a sense that, yeah, Francis was not a priest, but he's intimately linked with Christ's sacrifice. This is also something you need to understand about the Middle Ages. I'm going to say something to horribly scandalize you all. The Middle Ages were not as obsessed with the sacraments as we were. And I mean that in the best sense, meaning that for them, we've developed a really strong sense of piety towards the sacraments, which is probably healthy, but also because we've dealt with all these issues, namely medieval debates over the sacraments and the Protestant Reformation, where we had to go, yes, sacraments, right? In the early Middle Ages, or later early Middle Ages, there were these debates about the Eucharist, right, which continued for a while, and then you had the Protestant Reformation. So this constant having to say, yes, these sacraments are real and important, has really shaped modern Catholic piety. But for the Middle Ages, the sacraments were obviously important, but the gaze was much more focused on Christ. So the sacraments are a means to Christ, and to become like Christ, this is really at the center. There wasn't a great sense of sort of piety towards the sacraments, although of course they were held in great reverence, right? But even the development of benediction and Eucharistic adoration, that's a later medieval development. It's just sort of starting around Bonaventure's time. In fact, it was common, although this is not the way that we treat it now, it was common to consider the Eucharistic body of the Lord like Christ in the tomb, except when outside of Mass, or outside the reception of communion. It's an attitude that has changed very different from now, right? We think of Christ's presence in the tabernacle as something to visit, as something to spend devotional time around, which is a good thing. But in ancient Christianity and early medieval Christianity, that hadn't developed yet. And so, for Francis to be connected with the altar, it's not really important for him to be engaged with the sacrament in the sense of performing it. What matters is that he is like Christ, who is the sacrificial victim, and that link is much easier to make when you don't have this strong sense of needing to say, oh, well, he has to be a priest to be connected with this thing. It's a different worldview, quite different from our own. Remember that our long Catholic history is sometimes very different from what we think of it as today. Okay, moving along. So these are all selections from this first chapter, the first of 15. I'll give you a sense of the shape. I'm going to look at some selections, and then we'll finish up. Anyway, I jabber for a long time. I could go on probably for another 4 hours. I could give you, précis of my dissertation, ideas for articles I'm going to write, that kind of stuff, but I won't do that. So, boo. I'm sorry, Archie, I know, you want the 4-hour version, the extended cut. You can come find me, 481. Okay, so, In the other 14 chapters, we get a mix. Becoming Joe. We get a mix of sort of a historical overview of Francis's life and an overview of his virtues. But the pattern that Bonaventure uses is quite clever. So he takes basically 7 chapters that are about the history of Francis's life. But he doesn't put them first and then give us 9 chapters on his virtue. He does something way more interesting. What he does is he gives us 4 chapters about Francis's life. So he goes 2 before he was officially professed, 2 in which he's joined the order, in which he's founded the order, and then in which the order develops. And then he says, now I'm going to tell you about Francis's virtues. And he gives us 8 chapters on Francis's virtues. And they go in this order. Well, 8 and 9. I'll tell you how that works. He tells us first about one set of 3, austerity, humility, and poverty. Then he gives us another set of 3, piety, charity, and prayer. Then he gives us 3 more, which don't really sound like virtues, sound like acts. Prophecy and scriptural interpretation, healing and preaching, and then the stigmata. Now, no one really says, what's a virtue you have? I have the virtue of the stigmata. No. But he does. And this 9th one is a combination of both history and Francis's virtues. The summit of his virtue, but it's also when he gets back to history. So he finishes it with this 9th virtue chapter, which is also the 5th historical chapter, and then he's got 2 more. Francis's dying in 14, and his funeral rites and afterlife, sort of, let's say his afterlife both above and on earth, in chapter 15. So we actually have this beautiful way in which we have 7 chapters wrapped around 9 chapters. These are both very holy numbers for Bonaventure. 7 being, of course, the days of creation, the number of the sacraments, so many other 7s. 9 being the 9 choirs of angels. In fact, the seraphim shows up in the 9th of those virtue chapters. That's not an accident. And in fact, part of my dissertation's work was to show how all of these chapters are based upon the division of purification, illumination, and perfection at multiple levels. So that this is actually operating on multiple levels. So let's say one of the chapters, let's say the first virtue chapter on austerity is sort of devoted to the act of purification, which makes sense for austerity, but is also set within a larger scale in which the first 4 chapters are about purification. Illumination is the topic of the 9 virtue chapters, and then perfection in the last 2. But within itself, austerity is also subdivided into purification, illumination, perfection in terms of the different moments of the episodes within it. So that it's kind of like purification within illumination within, or purification within illumination. So he's got this really complex set of how these all fit together. I won't get too much more into that, but when you step back and realize what he's done here, he's been really careful about how he's divided up all these old lives of Francis and put them in just the right places to give you the picture that he wants of this transformation of Francis all the way through and at multiple levels again and again and again. So he's constantly in this cycle at multiple levels of purification, illumination, and perfection, which means he's always undergoing a transformation. There's no end to it. And of course, this helpful 3 set is also Trinitarian. In a sense, the Trinitarian motion is always being lived in Francis at every level of his life. And then, of course, those virtues are kind of angelic. Then historical life, we'll have the days of creation. So we have sort of this invisible, visible division. It's quite incredible. So what happens? Well, what we see in 1 is a very sort of physical act of poverty. As things move along, however, Francis's poverty develops as more spiritual character. Does anyone want to read 7:1 for me? Jimmy? Sure. So this is something that Francis had to say.
Poverty is the special way to salvation, the stimulus of humility and the root of perfection. He taught his followers continually celebrate the Lord's Passover in poverty of spirit, that is, Christ passing from the world to the Father, passing through the desert of this world like pilgrims and strangers, and like true Hebrews.
This comes from the 3rd chapter on the virtues, on poverty, where he's developing this idea that poverty is in fact the way to emulate Christ, so that by becoming poor, I didn't write this in here, we can become enriched by the divine poverty by which Christ has enriched us. So Bonaventure has the sense that when God became human in Christ, he actually performed an act of poverty, and he calls this his divine poverty, his laying aside his glory, which is in fact the most glorious thing he could do, especially if you listen to the Gospel of John. Now, in the Gospel of John, Christ's death is actually always referred to as his glorification, that act of sort of complete emptiness, which is in fact the fullest thing of divine love that divine love could possibly do. Here we have the same sense, where Francis is this figure in whom we have poverty, which is not just a physical sort of, let's call it a precondition for holiness. Like, first of all, you get rid of your stuff, now you can be holy. No. For Francis, for Bonaventure looking at Francis, his act of poverty is actually his imitation of Christ. And by becoming poor, not just in a physical way, but ultimately by letting go of even his own desires, even his own intellect in a way. If you read the full chapter, you see how basically it's the chapter in which Francis says, I let everything go. My whole self, gone. I'm not my own anymore. This is his association with the cross, where he passes over like true Hebrews. Now, why does he talk about true Hebrews? Does anyone get what's going on here? It's pretty dense.
So is it something like related to like passing through the Red Sea?
Right. And of course, the cross is often associated with Passover.
Mm-hmm.
And so he sees Christ as the one who's passing through the truest Red Sea, and we following after Christ are like the true Hebrews. And so Bonaventure says, by living this life of poverty, we are performing Christ's act of passing out of the world. So no longer is it a matter of sort of leaving physical things behind. It's even leaving the world while still in the world. It's what he calls the transitus, the passing over, which is pretty cool. And so what we see here in these middle chapters is a turning away from the sense of simply physical poverty, although that's never relinquished, to a sense of spiritual poverty. Now, what happens here is that Francis becomes more and more like Christ in these chapters, and we see he has a greater and greater zeal for souls. So if you look at 8, I'll read this one. True piety this is from the very beginning of chapter 8. True piety had so filled Francis's heart and penetrated its depths that it seems to have claimed the man of God completely into his domain. This piety, through devotion, lifted him up into God, through compassion transformed him into Christ, through self-emptying turned him into his neighbor, and through universal reconciliation with each thing, every creature, refashioned him to the state of innocence. So that piety that was performed through poverty has actually completely transformed Francis. It's elevated him to God, it's transformed him into Christ, and it has made him a benefactor for human beings, and it has actually totally reshaped his relationship with creation. Because he's become like Christ, he now has a right relationship with the whole world, which is where we get many of these animal stories about Francis, where all the animals are coming after him. They're like, Francis, 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 you're basically Jesus. Which is, the point, I think, of many of these stories is to say that he is like Christ standing in the Garden of Eden, with creation just bowing to him. Because what creation sees in Francis is, you're our master. And so he's got a right relationship with it. And so animals follow him, they pray with him, they're obedient to him. And what this is to do is to say, yeah, through poverty and through piety exercised through poverty, or through poverty exercised through piety, as we've seen those two are sort of deeply linked, you get a transformation of Francis into Christ. And on top of that, when you go to chapter 9, what we see is that Francis ends up not only giving himself away, but even desiring martyrdom, where he says, I want to die a martyr. I want to be sacrificed just like my God for the sake of souls. So in 9 we read, he was joined in a bond of inseparable love to the angels, who burn with a marvelous fire to pass over into God and to inflame the souls of the elect. And on top of that, also from 9, let me bring it up, he says this. Christ crucified was always rested like a bundle of myrrh in the bosom of his soul, into whom he longed to be totally transformed through an enkindling of ecstatic love. So he wants to be basically burned up with love. And as a sign of his special devotion, he found leisure from the Feast of Epiphany through 40 successive days, that period when Christ was hidden in the desert, resting in a place of solitude, shut up in a cell with as little food as possible, fasting, praying, and praising God without interruption. He was borne aloft into Christ with such burning intensity, but the beloved repaid him with such intimate love that it seemed that the servant of God was always before his eyes, as he once, there we go, like a yoke, as he once intimately revealed to his companions. And then, there we go. And then, a little bit later in the same chapter, in the fervent fire of his charity, he strove to emulate the glorious triumph of the holy martyrs, in whom the flame of love could not be extinguished nor courage weakened. Set on fire, therefore, by that perfect charity which drives out fear, he desired to offer to the Lord his own life as a living sacrifice in the flames of martyrdom, so that he might repay Christ, who died for us, and inspire others to divine love. So Francis makes the shift of filling up their physical needs to desiring to fill up other people's spiritual needs. Not leaving the physical needs behind, but pointing even something higher. That he wants to be burned up with divine love so that others will be caught up into that same divine love. And altogether, this is not just sort of a desire that he has for other people. Alongside this, he has this intense vision of Christ before him. So the deeper he comes to want to be like Christ and to see Christ, the more he desires to do like Christ, which is to basically cooperate in the salvation of the world. So where does this lead Francis to? Ultimately, this brings him to the stigmata, where this divine fire, as Bonaventure would say, sort of burns up interiorly and becomes, then again, physical. So you see this interesting transformation of sort of going from the physical poverty to the spiritual poverty, from fulfilling physical needs to fulfilling spiritual needs, from serving God in physical ways to serving God in spiritual ways. But then it sort of, those two come together when in the stigmata, the spiritual reality of his interior transformation of Christ breaks through his body. And all of a sudden, he's most powerless now. Because Francis doesn't even ask for it, he doesn't want it, and he tries to hide it. So Francis has become sort of so burned up with the divine love that he can't control it anymore. It's out of control. So Francis has really relinquished himself to the point that he can't hide these signs, or he tries to, but they escape. They bleed through the rags, or people sneak up on him and take a look. So that he has gone beyond the point of activity to sort of a pure passivity, but a far holier passivity. Which is quite interesting, actually, because when you look at medieval doctrines of the Trinity, sometimes the Holy Spirit, who is associated with fire, is also associated with the kind of divine passivity. So he's maybe become very much like very much impregnated by the Holy Spirit in this divine passivity, where he has so much relinquished himself that God's work is so visible in him and so much more powerful than if he were sort of physically active and doing his, preaching and healing in the world. After this, in chapter 14, Francis is dying, and as I told you before, he has to be carried about. He is so weak, but now he's more powerful than ever, and moreover, it's not just his individual preaching and healing and those sorts of things, or his acts of poverty giving things to other people through that poverty, but it's that he is this kind of living proof of the holiness of the way of poverty and penance, that he is not just doing an individual good, but he's doing a corporate good. He's sort of proving through his order that, yes, this is the way to Jesus. Here it is, visible, attainable, and you can do it. And Francis is therefore this seal of sort of God's approval on the Franciscan order, and therefore a seal of what the Church can do to revivify itself in its stagnant years. And then he dies. And what's interesting about his death is that Bonaventure then says, and now he's more powerful than you could possibly imagine. Because he has died, and he showed us a holy death, and he has left behind this order so that he, on the one hand, works good from heaven, and has left a perfect testimony of how Christ can be followed. And so now that he's most dead, he's even more powerful. Sort of turns our understanding of what power is on its head. And that, for Bonaventure, is his perfection. I'll stop there.
Thanks.
You're welcome. So this is just a taste of this text. But I think this is sort of one of the central themes that runs through it, and I think it's really helpful to think about, because it runs contrary to so much of our typical understanding of what perfection means, either in day-to-day life or even in holiness, in the life that we live as Christians. We sort of like to think, how much did I merit? Wrong. The answer is how much have you been given over to God? You know, you can do lots of things, but you know, for Francis, it's in a sense dying and weakness, in which God is actually most fruitful in us. Yeah. Questions? If you don't have any questions, that's fine.
So, go ahead.
I just have a comment in general. So I was the Jesuits, for as people may know, for a couple of years, and we talked about the evangelical councils in our classes, and kind of got some formation on it. And it's very interesting just hear the difference between the Franciscan kind of view of poverty versus the Jesuit view of poverty. I know there's a joke there about that, but it very much, the Jesuit view was very much more spiritualized as opposed to concrete, which you can see out in how the order lives out. It's how it does its mission today. So it's just very interesting kind of how the Franciscan order very much was that concreteness to start, transforming to like the spiritualization, where the Jesuit order there's very much a spiritual reality to start, and that's kind of the basis of how the power was lived. So just interesting kind of like compare and contrast between two large orders in the church.
Well, that became a big debate over this idea of usus pauper. So did poverty mean for the Franciscans that there was no individual ownership, or did it mean you have to live a kind of life of poverty? Doesn't mean, for instance, there are discussions by people of Peter of John O'Leary, who talk about this directly, saying, well, yeah, of course, we're Franciscans. We ought to live a poor life. It's not just good enough for us not to own things. There are plenty of nice things that we can have without owning them. I mean, there are all these cardinals giving us stuff. And he even said that, yeah, bishops should live like Franciscans too. They should give all their money to the poor and to the liturgy and drop riding on horses. Maybe not a bad lesson for today. Yeah. And there were Franciscans who went so far as to fight for usus pauper that they did get burned at the stake. They also wore really short tunics. People quipped that they could see their bottomuses.
What's that word you're using, usus?
Usus pauper, which means poor use, meaning not only not owning things, but having things that are not rich, that are not ornate. And O'Leary, who is one of the main people engaged in this debate, said, this doesn't mean a Franciscan can't occasionally have chicken, but, not day to day. They have chicken every day. Yeah.
But they didn't have Chick-fil-A back then.
They didn't have Chick-fil-A back then. So this debate would not even have arisen, especially on the free chicken days when you wear the cow mask. Or church. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole variety of fried chickens. I could have really tipped this debate in an opposite direction.
So a kind of historical question, Luke, which is, I mean, the thing that's very striking is, Francis from this text is not someone to be kind of admired, but he's to be imitated, like he's the model. And it's very much, you through your act, you are being kind of conformed to Christ. And I wonder, did that raise debates in the 13th century around kind of free will and grace? Because it seems like Francis, from the portrait that you get from Bonaventure, this is very much him acting out of free will. And I wonder if that kind of ran up against kind of the Augustinianism of that.
That's an interesting question. I've never seen that one come out. The debates that usually tend to come up are whether or not Christ was poor like Francis was poor, or the other mendicant orders wanted to be. Whereas the debates around will don't seem to come in much. Or maybe they do, and maybe they're there and we just haven't looked for them. That's a good question. Yeah, so most of the debates, especially even in Bonaventure's time, were, well, how ought we to live, and what is the real imitation of Christ? What is interesting, though, is that there aren't a lot of religious orders that say imitate our founder. But Francis is kind of unique in that he's an object of imitation. You don't have Cistercians going, well, let's imitate. Oh, who founded the Cistercians?
Bernard of Clairvaux, or
yeah. Bernard is one of the first Cistercians.
Well,
Bruno, and then, or even the Dominicans. What's that?
Norbert.
No, yeah, you don't have Norbertines imitating Norbert. You don't have Dominicans saying, let's imitate Dominic. In fact, the Dominicans even, speak of their father Francis. Francis is still an object of imitation. So that is, rather unique among the Franciscans to say Francis is a model. And even sort of direct imitation of Christ language, sometimes you have founder figures as sort of sort of modeled upon Moses. And Francis is to an extent, but Bonaventure really plays the Francis is an imitator of Christ card strongly.
Yeah, because we never got Ignatius as that,
No.
the seraphic image or anything else
Yeah.
like that. He was definitely a model
Yeah.
in the formation, seen as a really powerful figure and really, good saint to follow, but never this quasi-deification language that we're kind of seeing with Francis.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Where Francis is, for Bonaventure to use that language, sort of the practical model of what deification looks like in the world, precisely because he's cruciform, because you see the cross in him. I think that's what makes the difference there.
Is Francis the first stigmatic?
Francis is thought to be the first stigmatist, but there are some claims that some earlier saints received the stigmata. But Francis is the first one who's really thought of as stigmatist. So others, I think, have been thought that in retrospect. Sometimes you go to online lists and it was Saint Paul. You're like, okay. But usually it's Francis is thought of as the first one to really be talked about in those terms. Yeah. Jimmy, I saw you.
So I was kind of wondering, before you really have Francis and you're reading the Beatitudes and you get to the point of, blessed are the poor in spirit, is there maybe a turning point for the way that the church really engages that specific beatitude through the lens of how Francis is engaging that?
That's a really interesting question. And, so much of the history around the mendicant orders does have to do with what does poverty actually mean there, and it seems in some ways like that the mendicants as a whole are sort of the first corporate attempt to do this, at least safely within the bosom of the church. If you have other groups that live like this but are often get condemned, then in the early church, there's the sort of the rising question of what is meant by poverty and what's the church relationship to poverty. I'm reading a book right now. Actually, I think I have it with me. It's quite interesting. Called The Hungry Are Dying, which it looks at the sermons on poverty by the Cappadocian fathers, so St. Basil the Great, St. Gregory of Nazianzen, and St. Gregory of Nyssa, on their engagement of poverty, and especially the image of Christ as poor, or the poor as belonging to Christ. So that is certainly out there, and you have discussions of poverty, sort of like monastic poverty as non-ownership, but you don't really have any movements, these large ecclesiastical movements, that embrace a kind of not only lack of ownership, but a distinct sort of strong, personal, almost crude austerity. So they do seem to be a bit of a turning moment. Although, they would claim, at least the Franciscan claimed, that we're actually imitating the early church. So, part of the question comes down to what did the early church itself practice, or what did Christ practice becomes the big question for them, and that becomes one of the big fights around the Franciscans and the Dominicans in the last quarter of the 13th century. Yeah, because it really, in some ways, was unprecedented. What's interesting, though, is Bonaventure did have a sort of a sense of development. So he had a sense that Scripture actually had seeds in it, and that the church came to understand those seeds better over time. So Bonaventure is one of these first to articulate a real sense of the development of the understanding of Scripture over time. And so that is part of their argument too. Yeah. But like most Reform orders, they always go, we're living like the early church. Which is what everybody likes to claim, right?
So are you going to be holding more seminars on this?
Well, if anybody would like me to come back and speak about other aspects of this text, I would be happy to do so. Or anything else on Bonaventure, or anything else. But if that isn't interest, speak to Jimmy, and I would be pleased to come back, of course.
Yeah. One more question.
Sure.
So Francis has a type of distinction in that he has 2 feast days.
Yeah.
On the liturgical calendar, not didn't translate into the new calendar, but it's in the old calendar that he's got 2 feast days, like John the Baptist, or Our Lady has a million, but
yes, of course.
But so why did they see it so fit to make give Francis another feast day?
Well, So let's see, because we have the fourth, and then the other one is the transferal, right? The transferal of his remains, because his remains were moved.
Right. Okay.
And I imagine that these were probably Franciscan feasts to begin with, and that the widespread influence of the Franciscan order in the church led them to be adopted. So religious orders will have their own feast days internally, and so there are like tons of Franciscan feasts that will be only celebrated by Franciscans. But given that the Franciscans were so widespread, even today, there's still lots of Franciscans out there. That probably accounts for why both of those days would be celebrated outside of the bounds of the Franciscan order.
Yeah, because you have, the Norbertines have the Feast of St. Norbert and then the translation of his relics as well.
Yeah.
Within there.